First, cut the pieces of your pattern out. Don't use your fabric scissors, but normal paper scissors. Check if the pattern has already taken seam and hem allowance into account. Seam allowance is the area between the stitching and the fabric's edge at seams. Hem allowance is the additional fabric added to the length of a garment that is folded over to prevent fraying of the fabric. Our patterns include a seam allowance of 1 cm and a hem allowance of 2 cm. This is indicated with a dotted line. If the pattern does not include seam allowance yet, you need to add it to the pattern while cutting. Before cutting the fabric, you need to fold it in half, lengthwise, so that the two selvages meet. The selvage of the fabric is the finished edge of the fabric. The right sides of the fabric should be together. The right side of the fabric is the printed or pretty surface of the fabric. The other surface is the wrong side of the fabric. You usually sew things with right sides together, so the stitching will be on the inside of the finished project. If you're using solid fabrics, such as linen, there isn't a right or wrong side when you start on the project. However, once you've chosen a side, you should stick with that. You can identify the right side of the fabric by the seams. This will be the right side of the fabric, and this will be the wrong side of the fabric. Now fold over the short side of the fabric as well. Then put the side of the fabric that says fold on that fold line. Make sure it fits. Instead of fabric scissors, we use an electrical cutter. And instead of pins, we use weights. Put the weights on the pattern to ensure the pattern stays in place. On really small places, where the weights don't fit, put in a pin. Now, cut around the pattern. When cutting the pattern, pay attention to notches. They are indicated with small triangles or scissors like this. The notches should be transferred onto the paper. This is done by making very small nicks in the fabric, only about 2 to 3 millimeters. This is enough of an indication so that when you are sewing together the garment, you can easily tell where the notches were placed. We have cut the back twice now. However, the pattern indicates that we need to cut it 4 times, so we are going to repeat the process. Let's cut the scarf. The scarf pattern also needs to be put on the fabric fold. In addition, it indicates we need to cut the scarf twice, so we are going to fold the short side of the fabric over as well. Then we put the pattern on the fabric with fabric weights and we cut it out. The last thing to cut is the strap. This also needs to be cut twice. Find 2 fabric leftovers that fit the pattern, put them on top of each other, put the pattern on top, pin it and cut it out. To prepare your sewing machine for use, there are a few important steps you should follow to ensure that it is properly threaded and ready to sew. Firstly, you need to wind the bobbin for the lower thread. To do this, place the spool of thread on the spool pin, pass it around the tension desk and bobbin before pulling it through the small hole in the bobbin. Secure the bobbin onto the bobbin pin and move it to the right to lock it. Some machines automatically disengage the needle movement when you lock the bobbin, but on other machines you may need to press the sewing machine wheel to do this. Once the bobbin is in place, wind it a few times by pressing the pedal of your machine. Cut off the loose thread and then continue pressing the pedal until the bobbin is full. Now we're going to thread the upper and lower threads. Begin by placing the spool on the spool pin and following the arrows to pass it through the machine. To ensure that the upper thread is properly threaded through the machine, it's important to check that the lever is visible and that the thread passes through it. If the lever is not visible, you may need to turn the wheel on the side of your machine towards you until the lever becomes visible. Once the thread passes through the lever, guide it through the hook at the top of the needle and finally through the eye of the needle. To load the bobbin, open the compartment under the needle and insert the bobbin, making sure that it rotates counterclockwise when pulling the thread. Guide the thread along the metal notch to keep it in place. To pick up the lower thread, hold the upper thread and turn the wheel on the side of the machine towards you to send the needle down and up again. When the needle is up, the lower thread will come up in a loop around the upper thread. Use scissors to pull the loop of the lower thread through the needle plate and trim the excess thread. There are a few settings you need to check. First, the upper thread tension. 4.5 is suitable for most fabrics. Only very lightweight fabrics require a lower setting. Second, the stitch type. This machine has many, but for this course you will only use number 1, the straight stitch. Lastly, the stitch length. A stitch length of 3 mm works for most fabrics. Light fabrics need a shorter stitch length to prevent pulling. A longer stitch length works better for heavier fabrics. Take one of your leftover fabrics and draw a line with curves and angles using tailor's chalk. Lift up your presser foot. Place the fabric underneath so that the needle is at the start of the line. Make sure that both threads are under the foot. Lower the presser foot. You should start and finish every stitch with a back stitch to secure the stitch. Do this by gently pressing the pedal of your machine. After sewing 1 cm, go back 1 cm first. On my machine, you do this by holding down this button and pressing the pedal. Sew as neatly as possible over the line with the curves and angles. You should never push the fabric through the machine. Let it slide through and only guide the fabric where necessary. When sewing corners, make sure the needle is in the fabric so it doesn't slip away by turning the wheel of the sewing machine towards you. Never turn the wheel of the sewing machine away from you. Lift up the pressure foot, turn the fabric around and continue sewing. At the end, secure the stitch again with a back stitch. Go back 1 cm and then continue to the end. Lift up the pressure foot and cut the threads. Practice this a few times until you feel like you have control over your machine. Once you feel comfortable making stitches, it's time to practice making seams. Find 2 leftover pieces of fabric with straight edges and place them on top of each other. Remember that the right sides of the fabric should be together. Pin them together, but use as few pins as possible to save time later. You can use your hands to keep the fabrics aligned while sewing. I recommend placing a single pin in the middle of the fabric. To optimize your sewing process, it's important to orient your pins correctly. If the fabric is on the left side of the pin, make sure to face the pin head towards you. This is because the left side of your sewing machine provides the most space for sewing, so you will be sewing with the fabric on the left side. By facing the pin head towards you, you can easily remove it while you sew. This is what it would look like if you would put it in the other way around. You would have to bend over, disrupting your workflow. Conversely, if the fabric is on the right side of the pin, make sure to face the pin head away from you. Once you've turned the fabric around to sew with the fabric on the left side of your machine, the pin head will be facing you again. To sew accurate seam allowances, use the metal plate with markings on your sewing machine as a guide. For example, if your pattern calls for a seam allowance of 1 cm, align the cut edge of the fabric with the 10 mm marking on the plate. You can use a magnetic seam guide to ensure that the fabric remains parallel to the line on the plate, resulting in a perfectly straight seam. Once the guide is in place, position the fabrics under the pressure foot and start sewing. making a backstitch at the beginning and end of the seam. To prevent the needle from hitting the pin, remove it just before it reaches the presser foot. Ensure that the fabric stays neatly aligned throughout the sewing process, using your hands to adjust them as necessary. When you're done, cut threads off on both sides. To create the darts, follow these steps for each back piece on both the left and the right side. Align the two nicks that you previously made. On the fold line, put a small mark 8 cm from the bottom of the back. Draw a diagonal line from the nicks to this mark. Sew over the diagonal lines you made. Don't forget the back stitch at the beginning and at the end. Cut the excess fabric of the darts off and iron them open. Pin the label to the front of one of the back pieces. Stitch it 1 or 2 mm from the side on both the left and the right side of the label. Prepare the strap by ironing both long sides inward by 1 cm to create a clean folded edge. Use the steam function on your iron to help hold the fold in place. Also fold one short side of the strap inward for 1 cm and iron it. Cut the corners of the short sides off so they will not be visible later. Fold the strap in half, bringing the two long ends together, and iron it flat to create a crease in the center. Repeat this process for the second strap. Now stitch the folded edges 1 or 2 mm from the side, using the technique you learned to sew corners. Take two back pieces and place them on top of each other with their right sides facing inward. This way, the insides of the darts will be facing you. Pin the two pieces together along the outline of the back. However, remember to leave a hole at the bottom of the back for turning it inside out later. To mark where the hole should begin and end, place the pins vertically along the seam allowance. Sew along the pinned outline of the back, making sure to leave the hole open. And remember, the seam allowance is 1 cm. Repeat this process for the other two back pieces, but this time sew all the way around, without the hole at the bottom. Turn the back without the gap at the bottom inside out. Place that back inside the other one. Pin the curved edges of the back together. Put the strap inside of the back pieces and pin the unfinished end of the strap to the center of the curved edge of the back. Repeat this process on the other curved side of the back for symmetry, but place vertical pin at both handles, 10 cm from the top. These pins will serve as a guide for when you need to stop sewing. Now sew the pinned edges of the back together, using a seam allowance of 1 cm. Put a few cuts around the curved edge to make sure it falls over nicely later in the process. Turn the back inside out through the gap at the bottom. Fold the handles of the back open and place one handle on top of the other, the right sides facing. Make sure the seams align. Stitch them together, again with a seam allowance of 1 cm. Now close the gap at the straps by folding the edges inside and then sewing it about 1 or 2 mm along the edge. Repeat this step for the bottom of the back, ensuring that you sew as close to the edge as possible. And your bag is done! To join the two pieces, pin them together with the good side of the fabric facing each other. Remember to orient the pin heads according to the fabric placement. If the fabric is on the left side of the pin, the head should face towards you. If the fabric is on the right side, the head should face away from you. Leave a small gap at the bottom of the scarf to facilitate turning it inside out later. To mark the gap's boundaries, insert 2 vertical pins along the seam allowance. Stitch around the pinned edges with a seam allowance of 1 cm. Trim the excess fabric at the corners to reduce bulk, then turn the scarf inside out through the gap. To close the gap, fold the edges inside and close the gap with a stitch 1 or 2 mm from the side.